Hello everybody, my name's John, and I've just flown back to my home in the UK from China a couple of days ago. And I'm making this video because I think it's very important for people to understand the nature of the coronavirus situation in China where I've just been, and exactly how serious it is, the severity of the situation. Because I think it's very, very serious, and it's more serious than the mainstream media seems to be letting on. And I do have some insider information a bit about what's happening in China over the last week or so. I should say I've been living in China for nearly 2 years altogether. Speak a little Chinese, have a Chinese girlfriend. I've travelled a fair amount to China. I'm obviously no expert compared to many people who've spent longer than me. I've wanted to make videos about China for a while, but I always held off because, as many people know, if you start to make videos that are, let's say, political about China, you can quickly find that your visa is not renewed. You can find it very difficult to continue working there. And so, because of the coronavirus situation, I felt that it was too serious and too important to stay silent. And so, I'm going to talk about, the last week or so that's led up to me leaving China and what me and my girlfriend saw happening when we were in China over the last week. And so, about a week and a half, we were traveling in Guangdong. And we were doing this because we'd never been before, just to have a look around, do some sightseeing, and then go to my girlfriend's hometown in Guangdong, and a small town there, for Chinese New Year. At the time, actually, we knew about pneumonia cases in Wuhan for actually a couple of weeks, because I remember the first cases appeared around mid-December, and these were reported on Chinese state media. They were reported by the People's Daily. So they weren't secretive. They weren't massively reported. I knew about them, but most Chinese people didn't know about them. And again, we were told that it came from a wet market. And I actually have friends in Wuhan, which I'll talk about later. Alright, so we were in Guangzhou, and then when we were there on January 23rd, was when we first heard about an outbreak of this pneumonia, because it wasn't called the coronavirus then, they just called it pneumonia. And then we saw the number of infected people officially jump to in the 20s. And this was at the same time that people started getting infected in other countries. So I believe it was someone in Japan and a case in Thailand. And so pretty much straight away we knew that something was not quite right with the numbers, because the jump in numbers was quite high. It went from like 2 to 25 or something. And they also only reported on it when it started infecting people in other countries, so they couldn't hide it. Even then it didn't seem that alarming. It wasn't spreading that rapidly. We were concerned about it. I was concerned for my friends in Wuhan, but we sort of carried on, acting like everything was normal because there was nothing really to worry about. A few days later, we went to my girlfriend's hometown in Guangdong, ready to celebrate Chinese New Year. If you've never seen Chinese New Year in China, because in Western countries, Chinese New Year, you see the dancing lion, which is the fluffy lion that people dress up as, and they throw confetti and set off fireworks and hang out lanterns, and all of that goes on in China, but it's actually the main point of it is really the social aspect. So what goes on at Chinese New Year's, it's not only that everybody goes home to visit their family, so people will travel to their hometowns and then travel back after a few days. But you have this aspect where everybody buys like little treats, sort of snack food, dried fruit, and you're supposed to visit your family, visit your extended family, your cousins, your grandparents. You're supposed to visit all your friends and, exchange hongbao, red envelopes, which is just little packets of money, but say thank you, spend time together. And so it's actually probably the worst possible time in China where you could have had an outbreak like this, because it's just perfect conditions for a virus to spread at Chinese New Year. Everyone's visiting each other and travelling all over the country. And so this is the real tragedy of it, because then no one understood how serious the virus was. And so pretty much right on Chinese New Year, or a day afterward, my girlfriend goes out to see some of her friends. And one of them works in a hospital in Guangzhou. And she tells us that there are actually tens of thousands of infected cases all over China, and actually many thousands in Guangzhou itself, where we just were. And that they were under strict orders not to talk about this. So this was on January 23rd, I believe, or January 24th, when we got this news. And so the official numbers at that time were in the 20s or 30s. That was how big the disparity was. So this was coming from someone who was working at the hospital. Of course, because we can't estimate for certain the actual numbers, these are always going to be estimates that are generated based off the assessments of the people working at the hospital, of the doctors, but they actually have to make real assessments of the amount of sick people who are in China, because they're the ones planning for the treatment of the sick people who are going to come to the hospital. That's how they saw the situation pretty much a few days after it was really being reported on. This was when we also had reports from people inside China And in the first few days, there wasn't so much censorship on what was being covered about the virus. The news outlet Caixin, they're a kind of financial journal in China, and they've become very popular over the course of reporting on this. And they did interviews with doctors in Wuhan. There's actually one of the leading researchers on SARS who was actually leading the efforts to combat this disease, and he was sent there. And in this interview with Caixin, which I can't find now, I think it must have been taken down because I can't find the interview. I promise I'm not making it up. It should be around January 24th, 23rd. If anybody can find it, please let me know. But in this interview, he said that actually he estimated that thousands of people must have been infected at that time for it to have spread abroad that quickly. And this is one of the leading experts in China itself, not a Western country or in Hong Kong. So at the same time, you also had researchers in Imperial College, London, who gave an estimate that there must have been up to 10,000 people infected for it to have spread abroad based on their models. And I'll give a link to all this research in the description. So, and if you don't know, the government were, before the announcement of the virus, actually arrested 8 doctors who were working in the hospitals in Wuhan and tried to warn people about the virus, and they were arrested under this law for spreading rumours. In the last couple of days at the time of making this video, they're all being hailed as heroes because the Supreme Court decided that it was not a good idea to have detained them for talking about the virus, and they're all being hailed as heroes for warning people. So all reference to them being actually arrested by the police has completely disappeared. And now you're supposed to believe the exact opposite of what you were told a couple of weeks ago. And so that's the kind of censorship that people are dealing with in China. The other things that make you really doubt the official figures is the fact of how rapidly it's spread to other provinces. And we can see all these videos of infected cases all over China. If you're in there, you get videos for your friends over WeChat. It gets censored, but at the same time they can't censor it quickly enough to stop people seeing it, so they know it's happening. And actually the official figures are contradicted by what the heads of the provinces actually say. And so at this time, when we read about these reports and we started getting videos about what was happening, and we had that information from our friend, we started to panic a lot. And we especially started to panic when they started locking down Wuhan and other cities in Hubei province. Yeah, so in the beginning it was just Wuhan, and my friend who was in Wuhan, she actually got out, but she got out into another city which is less affected, and she's safe as far as I know. But she's one of the 5 million people who actually left after the announcement that it was going to be locked down. And you can really hardly blame those people for doing that. And so over the next few days, we saw more and more cities getting quarantined. And it was basically a few cities every day until it was effectively the whole of Hubei province, which was locked down. And that's 56 million people. So that's more people than live in South Korea under quarantine. An incredible amount of people who aren't able to leave their cities and travel outside of China. And actually, since then, we've seen cities outside of Hubei being quarantined, but I'll talk about that later. The quarantine is when we and most of my friends who are living in China really started to panic, because the nightmare situation was that we were going to get stuck in a quarantine zone and not be able to leave into an area that was less affected. And at the time, Guangdong was the second worst affected province, exactly where we were. We already had this information about Guangzhou being very affected. And so we decided, okay, if they start looking down places in Guangdong, we're going to go to Hong Kong. Because for those of you who don't know, mainland hospitals are very, very under-equipped to deal with any kind of complicated medical procedure. If you go to most hospitals in a rural area, especially in a small town, the staff really don't have the training or the equipment to deal with anything like this. So the nightmare situation was getting sick and then being stuck in a Guangdong village where the hospitals don't know what soap is. A few days before, we were thinking that, well, it's probably bad in certain big cities, but we're in a small town and it's probably not going to come here, we'll be alright. But then people started to get infected inside the town where we were. And so that was kind of the last straw for us, me and my girlfriend's family and her. We decided, right, okay, we're going straight to Hong Kong. Because at the time, there were rumours about them closing the border. Since then, they've partially closed the border. We got straight in the car, drove to the border, told many people on the way to stay inside, not go out, be very, very careful, stocked up on sanitary products. And then we got to the border. It was all fine. It was actually very, very quiet at that time. And this was, I think, around the 25th or 26th. And at the time, almost no one was there. And then a couple of days later, there were thousands of people trying to get through the border. But when we went through, foreigners have to go through a special foreigner lane when they cross the Shenzhen to Hong Kong border. And we knew there were health checks being enacted. But when I went through, there were pretty much no health checks. They were checking people's temperature. But they're actually only checking 1 in every 10 people. And then I asked them, do you need to check my temperature? And they said no. So we walked them through just fine. And that was only in the special foreigner lanes. In the lane for mainlanders, which my girlfriend's family went through, they weren't checking anybody. This is how seriously the government were taking it at that time, barely doing anything. And actually, after we arrived, they did start to quarantine cities in Guangdong. They quarantined Shantou, which actually only had 2 confirmed cases of the virus, which was a lot fewer than where we just were in Guangdong. They haven't officially quarantined many others since, but I've since heard that they've made it illegal to actually leave the city of Wenzhou in Zhejiang. And actually Shanghai and many of the cities are apparently effectively under quarantine, although they haven't officially announced it because they don't want people to leave. And actually, on the face of it, the numbers that the government are giving do not make any sense, because if you look at it, Wuhan alone has over 300 hospitals, because they went on a big campaign to build more hospitals in 2018. They have 336 hospitals. Now, it is a very big population, 11 million people, but actually it's similar to London and New York. And actually, 336 hospitals is more hospitals than there are in London or New York. So this, even with the large population, it's more hospitals per person than there would be in a Western city. And actually, for tier 2 cities, most tier 2 hospitals, they have to have more than 100 beds. And there are many tier 3 hospitals, because China has this tier ranking system, which have over 500 beds. If you look at the average capacity of occupancy in Chinese hospitals, the average is 83%. And now we can maybe make that a bit higher, because we're talking, it's in winter, people might be a bit more sick. But at minimum, there should be tens of thousands of free hospital beds. And so for them to have run out of room and build these new hospitals, which they started doing after the first few days, around the 24th, basically tells you that the official figures cannot be true. That's how many people they were having to refuse hospital treatment. And we've since had many reports from the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, about actually many people who died of the disease and were given another cause of death on the death certificate, and their bodies were cremated straight away. They weren't allowed a funeral. No time to even mourn, no time to say goodbye to your relatives who've passed away so quickly. And so it's a very tragic situation. And again, a couple of days ago, so around nearly the 30th, we started getting a lot more reports from other estimates from other researchers. So actually some of the lead medical researchers from Hong Kong universities came out and said that they estimated the official figures to be around 44,000 infected. And this was a couple of days ago now. And around the same time, you had the same researchers from Imperial College, London, say that they estimated 100,000 people to have the virus. So it's not like these are conspiracy theories, which is what the mainstream media, a lot of them are making out to be. You know, these are the top medical professionals in other Western countries that are reporting on this. And this is backed up by a lot of the video evidence that's come out of Wuhan and other surrounding cities. Now, people have tried to dismiss a lot of this and say for some reason the footage is either unverified or faked somehow. Again, BBC, CNN have tried to put forward the official figures and just basically accept them for some reason. In case we're forgetting, this is the same country that has incarcerated millions of Uyghurs in Xinjiang and lied about it for nearly a year, and then said they're all job training centres, and now it came out that they're, well, surprise, surprise, they were lying. And again, this comes from a place of ignorance of people who don't really know how the government works and the history of how they deal with these things. So they lied about SARS in 2003, and that's how it got so bad. They never admitted the full extent of the infections. They lied recently about the extent of the swine flu scandal, how it affected pigs. They lie about the crime rates. There's interesting articles about how they faked the crime rate data. They lie about the GDP numbers. They had to revise the GDP from 2018 down 30% in some cases. And so they lie about practically everything. Fortunately, it's a country where, because it's a one-party state and there's no accountability, you can't vote out your local governor who's corrupt or is faking the data. He's only accountable to the person above him if he really, really does a terrible job. And so actually, China's a country where almost everything is faked. But there's fake products for everything. There's fake masks being sold in Taobao. There's fake brands of cars. There's fake Starbucks, fake clothing brands, fake petrol stations that sell fake petrol. There's even a fake Terracotta army, where a bunch of people got together and made plastic casts of the Terracotta warriors, and then conned local tourists into coming to see them and saying, oh, this is all they had to show at the moment. There's so little enforcement of laws when it comes to these things. Sadly, it's the case where there should be very little reason to trust the government's figures on the face of it, let alone the incentives that they have to lie. First of all, they don't want to seem incompetent, and they don't want it to affect their GDP numbers. Yeah, from their perspective, if they can cover the whole thing up, put the numbers down as low as is conceivably possible, and hopefully it goes away, and then they can pretend like they had control over it the whole time. If it gets a lot worse, they just lie and change the numbers and remove any evidence that they ever said anything different, like they did with those doctors they arrested. That's the way it works, okay? Talk quickly about these videos that have come out on Twitter. A lot of people talking about how it's fake, how it's unverified, particularly with this video of the Wuhan nurse, who in the first few sentences she says along the lines of, I'm here to tell the truth, the government is hiding the real figures, and there are 90,000 infected. And then goes on to say, please stay inside, please, don't travel to these areas. Well, because at the time it was near the beginning of the outbreak that was reported on, and 90,000 seems like an incredibly high number. Now, I actually speak a bit of Chinese, and what she says is, 已经做完都人死. 已经 already, 做完 90,000, 都人 all people, 死. Now, 死 doesn't mean infected. 死 actually means dead. So I talked about this with my Chinese friends, and they've said that she doesn't finish the sentence. She should really have said 死了, like to make it a final sentence. And apparently 死 can also be interpreted to mean like passed out or incapacitated. People have interpreted that to mean infected. Usually you wouldn't use that kind of language. So people have pointed out that she doesn't have a Wuhan accent. Now, fair enough, I'm not an expert, but the Chinese government themselves have been talking about how they've taken thousands of nurses from all over China and taken them to Wuhan. Also, people have talked about, the equipment is not typical of Wuhan nurses. Now, same thing, they're incredibly under-equipped with the equipment that they need to treat the infected. The governor of Hubei said that they actually need 100,000 hazmat suits or equipment a day to deal with the demand. Think about how many cases they must have to deal with if they're asking for 100,000 masks and hazmat suits a day. He also said that they don't even have 10% of what they need to combat it, so they are using any equipment they can get their hands on. So the fact that she's not wearing the exact equipment that nurses in Wuhan often wear, it's no evidence of anything. So just think about this for a minute. Think about what she's risking to reveal this information. Spreading rumours, or revealing information that the government doesn't want you to reveal, is punishable by a minimum 3 years in prison, if they choose to prosecute, and maximum any amount, and they can make up the charges and get it a lot higher if they want to. And so these people are risking long prison terms to reveal this information, but instead, the mainstream media chooses to side with the dictatorship that's imprisoning them, rather than the people who are risking their freedoms to do it. Like, for God's sake. And then we've had these other videos about this woman in the corridor outside a hospital with dead bodies on the floor, covered in white blankets and saying, these are dead bodies, they've been here since morning, nobody's moved them. Now, people have come out and said, she's wrong, they were just waiting there for treatment, they were just, sleeping. Again, they're lying there throughout the whole day, according to her. They haven't moved, people aren't treating them. Like, what do you think is more likely? And again, she's risking a prison sentence to do that. And this is also backed up by the cases of false reports and death certificates, and the videos that have come out in the last few days of movements of dead bodies, and the interviews of Caixin that have come out just yesterday, saying that some crematoriums in Wuhan were receiving hundreds of dead bodies a day for cremation. So the official death statistic, as they currently stand, are just over 300. If I had to hazard a guess, I would put the real figures in the thousands, if not the tens of thousands, and I would put the figures of infected in the hundreds of thousands, if not 500,000 level. And I know these sound like crazy figures, but you've got to remember the massive population levels in China, and that Wuhan alone has 11 million people in it, and we're dealing with an infection that has now not only affected all of Hubei province, but is almost as bad in provinces like Zhejiang and Hubei and Guangdong as it was in Hunan a week ago. So please bear that in mind. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about the situation in other countries. So what does this mean? The second worst affected country at the moment seems to be Japan, followed by Thailand, and then a few others like Singapore. It's just come to the UK, where I am now. We've had other cases. I think it's in around 25 countries now. One thing I'll say is, to be fair to the Chinese government, this is a pretty nightmarish situation to happen, to have a disease like this appear at this time of year. But at the same time, if it had happened in most other countries, it would have been dealt with a lot better, and that's just the truth of it. And they would have allowed a lot more foreign doctors to come in, to assess the logistics of the situation, to do the research in the places where it needs to be carried out, and to plan the response. Instead, they're choosing to do it all themselves, based on the data which they're lying about, which means that they can't possibly plan for the logistics. So, is this going to spread as rapidly as it has in China in other countries? We still don't know. We don't know how long it's going to go on for, but the way it looks is that this is probably the most serious disease since the Spanish flu of 1918. And I'm not saying that to really be alarmist, I really don't want to panic people. From what I've read and from what I've heard from experts, that's how they seem to be assessing it. And the real thing to worry about is that the coronavirus, the symptoms don't show for up to 2 weeks in some cases. And so recently they've enacted quarantines for people coming over from China. But even if you have one case in a country, it's almost impossible to contain it, because then you can have a lot of other people who are infected and don't know it, who are then infecting many other people. And from what we've seen so far, the virus is incredibly contagious. At the same time, most of the countries, they have a free press and they have the equipment to deal with it and they have the training. Governments should absolutely stop flights from China. I don't blame Chinese people for wanting to get out of China. I mean, I've done the same because I think it's a very serious situation. But they should continue to quarantine people, absolutely. They should do everything they can. Even with that, I don't think it will be enough to contain the spread. And it really depends on how long this lasts. On the positive side, there seems to be a very rapid scientific achievements in how fast vaccines are being developed. So there currently exists some form of vaccine developed by a Hong Kong researcher, and actually an Australian researcher, I should say. And although estimated to take months and months of testing before it's ready. And there's also been talk about this HIV cure, AIDS treatment that can cure cases of the coronavirus, or at least treat it. But actually, from what I've seen, that's only useful in very severe cases anyway. It's not like that could be used as a kind of vaccine. So what to do about it? First of all, definitely stock up on medical supplies like basic things, soap, hand sanitizer, masks if you can, although we don't know about how useful they are. Washing your hands is very important. If you end up being in an area where there's many cases, stay inside, only go out to buy food if you have to. And another thing I have to say about the charities in China, again, one of the horrible things about this is that so many charities in China are corrupt and you can't trust them, and they embezzle the money and steal it. And this has actually happened very recently with Red Cross. Red Cross China have actually been caught. I know this because I'm working with a group of people who've been trying to get supplies to hospitals to help them. Red Cross has been embezzling the money and donating it to private hospitals in other areas where they don't actually have cases of the coronavirus, and keeping it for themselves. So don't give any money to the Red Cross in China. Please, if you can, donate medical equipment, even things simple like goggles, rubber gloves, masks, sanitary products. Please donate that to doctors in China. The problem is not the money. There's actually a lot of money in China to get the supplies, but they can't physically manufacture them fast enough. Recently, Jack Ma has donated, I think, something like 10 million yuan to the vaccine researchers at a science lab, and I think this actually might be a better route to go down. I think it might be really worth giving money to these researchers, because the faster we can develop a cure, the less people will die. And so that might be the way to go down. But if I find a trustworthy charity, I'll be sure to post it in the description. There's a better account of the government's response over the last few weeks, which has been posted by a blogger from Wuhan, which I'll post in the description too, and please read that if you want a detailed description of their response. The last thing I want to say is, I know most people listening to this will be worried and quite sympathetic with the plight of many of the people who are suffering. Because it doesn't matter what you think about the government or anything politically of China. This is a horrible situation for people in China. There's probably many more people will die because of this, in a completely avoidable tragedy. And there is a subset of people who see what happens politically in China and see what the government does and sort of, in a way, turn a blind eye to the suffering, or sort of say, look what they did to the Uyghurs, this is God's revenge. I've actually seen posts along those lines. And I really want to say, like, please don't try and blame Chinese people for this. Like, the same thing with them, oh look, they ate these exotic animals at the market, so what do you expect? It's like, no, this is happening because of the government, which they have no control over. It's not the time to blame anybody for a political solution. This is absolutely just a tragedy brought on by corruption and bad governance. And ordinary Chinese people who, just like you and me, are victims of this. So please bear that in mind, and please try and give what you can, because it will save a lot of lives. So thank you for listening.